Well, mes amis, the unfortunate news that we thought was going to happen eventually has just been delivered to us. Via our Pompasou here on Twitter, he quotes what General Manager Marc Bergevin was saying about the Montreal Canadiens. He has confirmed that prospects Allan McShane, Cole Fonstad, and Samwell Hood will not receive contract offers from the Montreal Canadiens, and they will thus re-enter the 2020 NHL Draft. Now, of course, this is not a surprise, but at the same time, it still is newsworthy and still something that I think we need to talk about here, because when it comes to the Montreal Canadiens prospects and the guys that they were able to acquire in the 2018 NHL Entry Draft, which is where these three players were all drafted from, there are a lot of prospects, and as we discussed in the video where we talked about how the Canadiens kind of got screwed over by the quarantine and all that, there is a little bit of a problem that can arise if you have too many prospects, too many picks, etc. in your system. Something like this, where the Canadiens are forced to let go of three honestly not terrible prospects, is the result of some of those problems. So let's just go over the chronology of draft picks over here, because at the 2018 NHL Entry Draft, the Montreal Canadiens selected a whole bunch of forwards towards the middle and the end of the draft. They had Cam Hillis, a 66th overall pick. They had Allan McShane, 97th overall, Cole Fonstad, 128th overall, and Samwell Hood, 133rd overall. There are other players too, but these are the ones that are the most important in this context. As the years went on, some of these guys got a little bit better, like Cam Hillis, for example. He was a guy who got so much better as his years developing went on, and he got so good to the point where the Montreal Canadiens signed him to an entry-level contract earlier this summer. However, the other guys didn't really have the same amount of success. Allan McShane was drafted in 2018, where he had 65 points in 67 games, and then this past season, he had 67 points in 62 games played, meaning that his development wasn't really there. He was just kind of at the same production this year than he was 2 years ago. Cole Fonstad is a guy who did improve somewhat. He was just slightly over a point per game when he was drafted, then he became a little bit more over a point per game, and now he was even more over a point per game, but his goal-scoring side kind of wore off this past season. Then you have Samwell Hood, who, for all intents and purposes, kind of disappointed this past season. Sure, his points per game got so much better, and I cannot fault him for that, but at the same time, the steps that people wanted to see out of a Samwell Hood weren't there to begin with. So when the Montreal Canadiens were talking about their prospects and talking about signings and all that stuff, there was a very apparent idea that the Canadiens would need to choose between who to sign and who to keep in their system. It was this pool of Houde, Hillis, McShane, Cole Fonstad, and a few other guys that people were saying, you know, the Canadiens will only be able to sign at least one because they have limited space, they have so many prospects in the system coming up that need contracts, they have so many guys under contract already that it's just going to be a problem as to who they're going to be able to keep because they can't keep all of them. So, lo and behold, Cam Hillis was the guy that they chose. It's not a surprise. Anybody who was paying attention to the Habs prospects would say that Cam Hillis was the guy to sign, but now we finally know that Houde, Fonstad, and McShane are all going to go back into the entry draft. It's actually interesting because if the Montreal Canadiens really wanted to keep these players, they could just draft them again in the 2020 NHL Entry Draft. But of course, that's a very weird strategy. Honestly, I don't really know if any of these guys are going to get drafted again. Some people on Reddit and Twitter were talking about it, but for the most part, players like these, where they're a point per game and just only a point per game when they're 20 already in the CHL, these are the kinds of players that get tryouts and PTOs from other NHL teams. So if Fonstad, McShane, and Houde eventually end up playing in the NHL one day, it will most likely be through any of these tryouts with other teams. So the bottom line here is that the Canadiens just did not have the room to sign these prospects, and as a result, they're now going back into the entry draft and the Canadiens no longer hold their rights. Now, another interesting point that I saw on Reddit was this discussion over here on the little discussion on the Arpon Basu tweet. Take a look at this comment over here from Frecto Hay. This highlights the need for Montreal to get an ECHL team as soon as possible. We could be signing most prospects to AHL deals as a prove-it method and let them prove themselves both in the ECHL and the AHL. Now, this is a very interesting idea because an ECHL team existing for the Montreal Canadiens would indeed allow them to do these AHL deals. AHL ECHL partnership contracts do not count under the NHL's cap of 50 contracts because they're not allowed to play in the NHL if they have these deals, meaning that the Canadiens would be able to keep guys in their system for as long as they wanted to, or for as long as the AHL team would sign these players for, and the need to let them go back into the draft or get picked off by other teams and tryouts, all of a sudden, that threat isn't there anymore. So it definitely does put an interesting perspective on where the Montreal Canadiens are with their asset management, because an ECHL team would allow them to sign more prospects and more players under their organization just by proxy, pretty much. Because if they get signed to the AHL team, they're not Canadiens property, they're Laval Rocket property, and property of whatever ECHL team that happens to be a part of the partnership. So, interestingly enough, that's something that does present itself as a concern, but I'm not necessarily too sure if this is a big enough strike to make the Canadiens go into a desperate, we need an ECHL team right now mode. Because in my opinion, if the Canadiens saw the value in having an ECHL team, my understanding is they probably would have done it already. Now obviously, things could change and the Canadiens could get an ECHL team soon to allow them to sign more prospects, but I'm not necessarily too sure if this move right here, with the departures of McShane, Houde, and Fonstad, is the push that allows them to do that right away, you know? But of course, it definitely sucks to see prospects like these leave. If you take a look at the prospects tier list video that we made on the Habs a few weeks ago, or maybe even a month ago, I'm not too sure. If you take a look at the guys that we're talking about here today, I said that Allan McShane had bottom line NHL potential, same with Samwell Hood, and I said that Fonstad had middle six NHL potential, interestingly enough, alongside of Cam Hillis, so that might not necessarily be super aligned with what the Montreal Canadiens saw, because they signed Hillis earlier on and they seem to have had no problems with letting Houde, McShane, and Fonstad go. But that's just kind of how I saw it. McShane and Houde were a little bit down there lower on the depth chart than Fonstad and Hillis was. Even with Fonstad, I think that Fonstad is a legitimately pretty okay NHL prospect, especially with the developments that he took this past season with the Everett Silvertips, but at the end of the day, the Montreal Canadiens have a limited number of contracts and so many prospects to sign. And the consequences that we talked about in the Habs Screwed video are starting to show themselves off now. If you don't remember what we talked about in that video, though, pretty much the idea was that Bergevin would use these draft picks that he acquired to trade for NHL-ready pieces. But because there was that whole scare of the draft happening before the playoffs and teams being allowed to trade, it pointed towards a direction where the Canadiens would have needed to use their draft picks instead of trading them away, and eventually would need to trade away those prospects to acquire NHL-ready pieces, which wouldn't necessarily be all too great, because you could say that draft picks are certainly more valuable than already drafted prospects. But if the NHL draft is going to be held in the way that we think it is now, where the draft looks to be held after the playoffs, then hey, that all of a sudden takes the Montreal Canadiens out of this screwed position that I said that they were in earlier. So there might be a silver lining to all of this, where the Montreal Canadiens could honestly get off the hook and fulfill the plan like they wanted to if the playoffs go before the draft later this year. So interestingly enough, there could be a little bit of a spotlight here, but of course we're going off topic. Samwell Hood, Allan McShane, Cole Fonstad, three prospects that we honestly kind of got somewhat excited about 2 years ago. These guys are now out of the organization and re-entering the draft, ready to be taken by any team that sees the potential in them long term. So it was a good run, but at the same time, the Canadiens have too many prospects and too many guys that they needed to sign and under contract already, so the contracts for these 3 guys just weren't able to get done. But I hope you enjoyed this video. So that Trost99. Comment below your thoughts on these prospects, the picks, the situations, and the Habs in general. So that Trost99, and bye.